ocean's whisper calls my name. Depth and longing in my soul, seeking more than just this game. Waves crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whispered longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Fire, depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to When Deep Calls Deep. I guess we're having issues here. It's one of those days. I just got back. I finished the semester and then, like, a day later, got on a train and left for 10 days. So I'm just getting back and just getting back into being, that. So I'm a little spacey today because that my brain is not recovered from that 2.5 day train ride, which was really interesting. So sorry. Anyway, let me collect my poor ADHD brain, which is all over the place. Carey Griffel is here. I am so excited. It's nice to have Carey back. Thank you, Roddy. Yes, I am spacey every day, but it's worse today than normal. Welcome Carey back to the channel. I love and adore Carey, and it came up with what kind of fun things can I do to cover some stuff this summer, most of which hasn't worked out. But I like animals because, we can talk about animals. And one of my favorite animal people in the Bible is Carey and her love of donkeys and her, underappreciated animal imagery in the Bible, definitely. And there's just so much fun things to talk about there. So we're not going to, just prefacing, we're not going to touch the sacrificial system, and we're not touching clean and unclean. I have a whole Leviticus series that gets into that ad nauseum. So you go check that out. It's definitely, we'll cover that material. We're here to talk about some of the fun and the weird stuff in the Old Testament about animal imagery, because there's definitely some of that in there. But before we get too far into that, Carey, for people who don't know who you are, or it's been a while since you've been here, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody about yourself, and then we'll get going into some fun animal stuff.
Yeah, so I am really excited that Amber suggested this topic because it's so interesting. I could do a whole podcast just on animal stuff because there's just a lot there and it's interesting, and it feels contradictory as well. So that makes it really interesting, just because you're like looking at things and you think you understand it, and then you get thrown into a loop just because there's so many different frameworks about animals and things. But my podcast is Genesis Marks the Spot. It is a biblical theology podcast where I get into Bible context, and well, I do sometimes just kind of shoot off into different directions from there, because part of my passion is to take the context of Scripture, but not just leave it there. It's not just a set of really interesting information for me. I think it's something that really should speak into the church today. And so there's a whole lot of information out there about biblical theology and understanding themes and structure and all of these things. And all of that is great. But part of my passion is trying to work that into our actual church practice, understand it on practical level. And, animals are a thing that we all love, or at least most of us do. And there's a lot of animal imagery in the Bible, but some of it's kind of unpredictable, and a lot of it we don't understand because we're not in that ancient context. And so I think biblical theology kind of helps pull out a lot of that wisdom for us, and it kind of helps to connect our worlds together when we can find something that we care about, and the Bible obviously cares about as well.
Right. And now, as I'm getting ready to start my thesis here and shifting more from an singular Old Testament focus into intertextuality and landing more in that world, it gets even more interesting. So it's really fun, the links and the ties and things, and we might get into that. I don't know. We're Carey and I kind of go at things a little bit the same, as we're like, hey, this sounds like fun. Let's just go with it and see where we end up. So it'll just kind of be fun to throw that in there. But yeah, and that's one of the things that I love about intertextuality and biblical theology, is pulling out and adding the narrative component on the top of it. How do they fit into the story? So not only why are they there, what's the imagery, but what into context of the narrative, what is that telling us? Because there's some really beautiful things that are happening in that. But we're going to go start way back we're going to start in Torah. We'll just kind of land there for a minute, because it's really interesting to me with Torah. We learn from the beginning God cares about all of his creation, but animals also, because there is this whole concept where in the day 6, when all of that, God creates the animals, and then the plus extra part of the day he creates humans. But all of us have what in Hebrew is this word nefesh, which is this kind of complicated, a little bit word, but there's this really fun way to think about this nefesh word. And the way that my Hebrew professors both explained it, it comes from the idea and the concept of the throat, right? And that's that life would come in the way that they would understand it in way back when these old Semitic languages were being developed. And they, you're a nomadic or semi-nomadic people wandering around, and it's cold outside, and you walk out and you see, you get that condensation of your breath coming out. And then in their context, where all of life has religious and spiritual significance, like what is happening there, they're not going to care that that's condensation of hot lung air meeting cold outside environmental air. That's inconsequential to them. Like, what's going on imagery wise there? So they would see that as the spirit coming out of the body. And so where does life come in and out? Comes in and out of the throat. So I just love that that imagery that comes with that word nefesh. And we see that the animals are given that as well. So Carey, let's kind of we don't want to land here for too long, but just this idea that in that context, that means there's significance and spiritual significance to the fact that animals have that same breath as people.
Yeah, well, and it's tricky, because when you start getting into ideas of spiritual ideas and things like that, we're just thinking of it differently than the ancient people did. That's why we're doing biblical theology, so that we can kind of fix some of that, or at least understand it. That's all we need to do. And I've seen people who are like, oh, well, if animals have the spirit, and they start conflating ideas in really crazy ways, like, oh, animals are now just like people because they have the spirit, without realizing that there is distinction there. Right? Animals aren't called the image of God. There's a reason there. And so, you have to kind of really get into particulars. And this is why I think a lot of people are kind of people who want to do exegesis, people who want to really get into deep Bible study. A lot of times they start with like word studies, which, I mean, because then you can understand a word, you can see where the word shows up, and there's a lot to be said for that, because then you can start disambiguating some of that. But it's hard because there's still a lot of crossover. One of my interesting things that I've been working about and trying to develop is working in what's called frame semantics into biblical studies. And this is already something people do all over the place. They do it all the time. It's not always called this, which is fine, but the idea of the conceptual realm that a word dwells in. So word study is going to be great because it's going to start getting you focused into those conceptual worlds. But then you have to start disambiguating things and saying, this word means this over here, or it encapsulates this idea. And sometimes when you're doing word studies, another problem that we're going to, I think, encounter when we talk about animals in the Bible in particular, is that a word study is not going to help you out if there's contradictory imagery. And there is contradictory imagery all over the place.
Right.
But that's why frame semantics is helpful, because it will zero in on the particular use of the word, and you will draw that out from the actual text in its particular use by the author, right? So not everything is going to mean the same thing everywhere. But the fact that we have the nephesh that is associated with both animals and people, then we're going to start thinking, what are the similarities? And what does that mean for our theology? Because we don't want to just leave it in, well, that's interesting. Like, okay, yes, that's great. It's interesting. But what does it mean for us? And why is it important to even care about? And so I think that may be part of what you're trying to say, is that there is something important here about animals and God's view of animals. And, we know that the Bible is very subversive to the culture as well sometimes. I mean, not always, but this idea of caring for creation versus just utilizing creation for whatever purposes you want to use it for. And I think that's part of the point too.
Right. I just love how, first of all, how brilliant you are, and how you and I, from different ways, always usually end up pretty much in the same yard. Maybe not in the exact square of the yard, but you and I always kind of end up in the yard, because there is so much more of the bigger picture overview and how we look at that. And I think that when we get to the next time animals show up, when Adam is naming the animals, like, a lot of people get so stuck on this low resolution level. I look at all of these things, because it's like, there's some kind of like pop quiz exercise, or some sort of, assertion of dominance that Adam is over everything because he gets to name them all, or like there's this whole, but when you step back and you look at it through like the frameworking, and you look at it through the narrative, there's so much more going on there. And it does a whole lot of things. We don't have time to get into the whole breadth of everything that's going on there, because it's so beautiful and so vast. But you've got this, not only is God saying Adam is unique, but has the same nephesh connection, but also is going to be wrapped into, we're going to get into in a minute, into Torah, that really shows God's care for creation and how we should care about creation because of this whole concept and this whole idea.
Yeah, and I know we're not going to touch on the sacrificial system, but there is that connection with life and
Yep.
that meaning there. And
Mhm.
it's very deep to understand that, because there's a distinctive difference between focusing on one direction like life versus focusing on death and what those kinds of things mean. So like if we're picking up this imagery of the first time, that early animals are mentioned in Genesis and in scripture, we're picking up the Bible and we're reading about it, and there is this idea that they are special in a sense that
Mhm.
we are supposed to have some taking care of them, not in the sense of we can use them for whatever purposes. And that's part of, I think, the idea of the image of God is imaging God in creation, and that taking that care. So what we see of God and what we see of man and their relationship with animals is very deeply integrated here, I think.
Yeah, and then we're going to skip over this part, but you see that it repeated in Noah because God makes sure that man provides a way for animals to survive the flood as well. So it just is this repeating theme that plays out through the story over and over and over again. And Noah's another one of those we could do a whole episode about the animals and everything that's going on there in Noah, but we're just going to pass right on by that again, which, being the narrative and biblical theology intertextuality nerd that I am, just makes me cry internally because we have to skip it. But I do want to jump into briefly again Torah, because there are several provisions in Torah that talk about the animals and care of animals. And this was really surprising for me when I started digging into Torah when I was studying it my first semester in seminary. That there's this really you get stuck a lot on all of what's going on with the sacrificial system, and you did this wrong, so you need to here's the calculations of how many of what kind of thing, and we toss that out pretty quickly once you understand what's actually going on there. But there are several instructions in Torah for if you accidentally kill somebody's ox, or making sure that oxen and beasts of burden are fed while they're don't deny them food while they're working, and returning somebody's animal if it wanders off, and the restitution that has to be made if an animal is killed, or if someone doesn't properly contain a dangerous animal, and the consequences for that. Like, but there's it plays into, so this is what I want to kind of tease out before we jump into the actual imagery of the individual animals. Is is Torah is about preservation of life first and foremost. So a lot of those are you're getting into if somebody's ox or somebody's beast of burden is wanders off and you don't return it, or you kill it on accident, or whatever, you're putting that person's life in danger and their livelihood in danger. So, but God just not only cares about the function and utility of the animal for human survival, he's also caring about the working conditions and the survival of the animals themselves. So make sure you feed them, make sure they're included as a provision on the Sabbath, that animals need a day of rest as well. So Carrie, let's kind of jump into there for a minute before we head into specific animal territory.
Yeah, well, and I've seen people kind of take that a couple of different directions. Like, well, sure, animals are important, but it's still focused on human flourishing, and it's still focused on the idea of people being able, because if you don't treat your animal well, you're not going to be able to have your animal for very long, and therefore it's not going to help you out. That feels very utilitarian of a response to me. Like, I mean,
Right.
to a degree, yes, we're not going like a full the way that we're thinking of the care for animals, right? They're not personifying animals in a personal way like we do, I think, by large. At least it's not described that way. But to go to the direction that it's, I don't even know. There's some word I want to describe that as that's probably not a very nice word, but like there is a distinctive difference between, yes, they had a little bit more of a utilitarian and practical view of it back then. But again, there's still this idea. Actually, one of you linked a really interesting conversation from Mesopotamian okay, I can't even see it. So archaeologist who was talking about looking at animal bones, studying those for ritual. And one of the things that was really interesting in that was that there's some indication that at times the animals were sedated before they were killed for the sacrifice for the grave goods. Why are they going to do that if they don't care at all about animals and didn't have any kind of personal relationship of understanding they felt pain too, things like that, and that's outside of the biblical context. And so I think what we have in the Bible is a clear, distinctive care for life in all of its forms. Now, animal life isn't the same as human life. That doesn't mean that it's not just as important. There's still that emphasis on life in general, I think.
And I think that what I think where my brain was going there when you were kind of teasing out that whole utilitarian thing, that post-enlightenment Western mind thinkers love to break things into categories and love to define things by their function. And if you go back and you look at descriptions of animals in things like in an ancient Near East context or something, it's not described by the function that they do. It's a description of their characteristics or what kind of makes them that animal. And I think that it really adds to the biblical narrative of and the theme of this idea where all creation is a participatory experience with God, and that includes animals, how we treat animals, and include animals in our daily lives. And yes, when we say that, we're not throwing out the idea they don't have a utilitarian function, because we all do. There are things that we have, that we do different jobs that some of us are suited for and some of us are not, and animals can do that we cannot. So there is some utilitarian function there, but that's not the purpose that they're here and the purpose why we're here. It's for this reciprocal relationship that we do communally together. And how do we all bring our unique pieces? And that might include animals in this. Like, how do we bring our unique parts of our makeup into making a larger community more participatory with the rhythms of creation and interacting with our creator? So I think it's really important to understand, before we jump into these stories, stepping into the mindset of this reciprocating relationship idea and step away from the utilitarian function. And it might kind of give us a different perspective on some of what's happening in some of these stories here. So I want to jump into, I think, I know it's one of my favorites just because of all of the intertextuality that's going on. It's absolutely berserk and bonkers. And it's just because it's fun, because it involves donkeys. And it's one of everybody's favorite stories. So Balaam's donkey. I absolutely love this story. It is one of my all-time favorites. And I know, Carey, you definitely have a soft spot for donkeys in the Bible. So I'm going to kind of let you start with, let's talk about what in the world, Balaam's donkey and this poor thing, and what is happening with this poor creature here.
You know what? I actually love that you were just talking about the different types of viewing functionality. Because if we're only viewing functionality as the things that you're doing, then people are going to read this story as like part of the meaning is there's a talking animal. Mm-hmm. And that is as opposed to another view where you're seeing the talking animal as not a utilitarian, oh, well, gee, look at that, there's a talking animal, but rather that it fits into the whole intertextuality of Scripture. I did a whole episode on donkeys on my podcast. It was one of the funnest ones I've ever done. This is so cool because there's way more there than you even think. And in a lot of places in Scripture, I mean, donkeys aren't mentioned that frequently, but some of the mentions you're going, what in the world is this even talking about? And that's not even getting into the Balaam story. So then you get into the Balaam story, and it's a little bit hard for us post-Enlightenment people to look at that and get over this idea of the talking animal. But I mean, come on, we've already had a talking animal, haven't we?
Right.
We've already had that. So I'm not sure why we're getting quite so stuck on this one in particular.
Mhm,
I actually think that those two stories are connected. I
mhm.
absolutely think they are. And that's been brought out by several different scholars already. It's not my idea. It's not my idea. That's what intertextuality is all about. Like, you get all these people who are looking into the context of scripture, but also the broader themes and how they connect together. And when you start doing that, then the light bulbs start going off. Like, oh,
Yep.
this is more than just a weird story. Yes, it's a weird story, and it's meant to be weird. Like,
Right.
yes, everybody reading this or hearing the story would be like, okay, what is going on here? You're supposed to ask those questions. Then
Right.
when you ask the questions, you go, wait a second, we've already had a talking animal. What is the intent here? And for most of Christian history and theology, we have no real problem with understanding the serpent in the garden as Satan.
Right.
That's not what's going on here with Balaam and the donkey, though.
Mm-mm.
So it's kind of putting that on its head in a really, really interesting way. So
Right.
you start comparing those two stories, and there's similarities. There's similar language. If you are familiar at all with Hebrew, you can see a lot of similarity in the language. You'll see a lot of the similarity in the themes. If you like map out what's happening in the story,
Mhm.
a lot of similar things are going on. And I mean, we have so much to talk about here. I won't get into all of that because I already have.
Right. Right.
You can, but uh, but absolutely, go look at those two stories in parallel and see what's similar and see what's different. There's
Right.
things like enlightenment and opening your eyes, things like who's talking and who is providing the wisdom here. And so what we have here is actually an anti-Genesis story in some ways. It's fascinating, especially
Right.
when we have somebody who is not seen as part of the people of Israel coming into the land. There are so many layers there. It is so cool. You guys need to go look at it
Right.
from that perspective.
And I'll make sure and link that episode down in the description later when I go back. But it almost seems to me, Carrie, and I would actually love to hear your thoughts on this, because as I was reading through that the other day for um, um, a paper I was writing that didn't seem like it would have anything to do with that story, but it ended up doing, because intertextuality is weird and wonky, and I love it.
Mhm.
But as I was reading through that again, and I was like, it occurred to me, like all of that stuff that you just said, and I'm like, Balaam's donkey talking. This is kind of like a punchline of a giant joke that we've been set up for. Like, this is
Yeah.
hilarious when you look at
Mhm.
the absurdity
Mhm.
of the thing, and not get hung up on, well, there's a donkey talking, like,
Mhm.
can we, it's just that the fact that God sometimes has to do something so ridiculous
Mm.
as get a donkey to point out, y'all are dumb, like, this is a bad idea.
Right?
And, but
Yeah.
but the language and things, like you said, are drawing you back to Genesis, and you're like,
Mhm.
wait, so talking animals, not always necessarily a bad thing.
Mhm.
And, it's almost like Balaam's donkey is the punchline of a hilarious joke that, if you don't know how to read it that way, it's really, really funny.
Mhm. Right. And well, I think, most people, if they kind of get over this idea of just being super hyper literal with it, and then asking what is the impact of the story? I
Mhm.
mean, that's pretty obvious that, wait, what? What is going on? This is so
Right.
bizarre. Again, especially somebody outside of the nation of Israel, I think, is really going to hit home with, what do we take away from this? And if you look at Balaam and his interaction with the angel of the Lord and his interaction
Mhm.
with the donkey herself, that's fascinating. It's really interesting how we have somebody who isn't all that um, sympathetic to the people of Israel. Like, he doesn't have a reason to care particularly, like just natively in and of himself. And yet God is entering the situation and using something to really get him to a point where he's kind of smarter than a lot of other people in the end. I mean, not ultimately in his life in the end, but
Right.
in the immediate story, he ends up telling truth things that is really shocking. And that is as opposed to deception and things like that that we have in the Genesis story of half truths and things like that. And so part of that, part of the reason for that is the idea of enlightenment and where you're getting your enlightenment from. That's part of the thing that I take away from here. And it's really interesting that we have absurd ideas that are getting us to that point of enlightenment and wisdom. Like, oh, okay, so it's not quite this, I'm always going to go sit on the mountain and think really seriously about something. No, funny stories can get us there too. Yeah, okay.
Right. And I want to kind of just do a really quick for people who may be like struggling with some context of what's happening here. Let's step back out of the narrative a little bit. So we've had the Exodus, we've had Genesis. We're now in the book of Numbers. So the tabernacle is a thing, and we've had Leviticus has happened. So we now have figured out how to maintain God's presence in the tabernacle going with us. And the book of Numbers, I love to say, is the two worst road trips in history that is going on here, because they're living out this pattern of never fully living into the covenant. Israel never fully grasps who Yahweh actually is. And so you've got, the context of Joshua and Judges, it shows us that, and that all the other nations around understand Yahweh a lot better than Israel did. So the king of Moab sees Israel coming, and he's calls for Balaam to come curse these people because he doesn't want them to run over him like they have everybody else, because Yahweh is just clearing a path to get them to their promised land. So, he's in the way, even though he may or may not be aware of the rules for Moab and for the sons Ishmael and Esau, and that they don't completely lose all of the blessings, not being the chosen firstborn. So there's, and Moab is complicated, but, so the king of Moab's like, okay, get Balaam over here to curse these people so they don't come run over me with this God who's more powerful than mine. And so that's kind of the context of where we end up with this story of why is there Balaam and a donkey? What's happening here in the first place? So now we've got Balaam traveling along, and the donkey starts doing what the donkey does, and stopping and refusing to move and laying down like, we're not going that way. And Balaam, because his eyes are closed for multiple various reasons, starts to beat this donkey like, get up and go. We have to go. And eventually the donkey has to say to him, there's a big angel over there that's going to kill you if we keep going. And like, and just in the whole context of what's happening in the larger spiritual warfare, and understanding how this deities don't invade each other's territory. That's the job of people to go conquer it and then bring your deity in. And Moab being terrified of Yahweh coming, and the king like, no, I'm not going to let Yahweh take my life and my livelihood and my existence away. Like, so, yeah. So Carey, the significance of that message, don't be dumb, has to be given by a donkey. Let's talk about that for another minute. I just love that picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's interesting because once you get into the context of how ancient people understood donkeys, yes, there is this idea of stubbornness. There is an idea of maybe some lack of intelligence compared to other things, but I don't think that's really the primary thing that they were thinking of for donkeys. For us, we kind of are. Now, that's not to say that there's nothing in there about that, because again, there is the stubbornness factor for sure. But the idea of also this donkeys were seen a little bit in a higher view in a lot
Right.
of ways than we tend to see them as well. So it's not, it's, sometimes I've seen this story told and presented as if God's using the dumbest and stupidest of the animals. I don't know, because donkeys are also a very royal symbol. So
Right.
there is that as well. The idea of God using a royal symbol to communicate something to people to open their eyes. And that's an interesting parallel as well with the garden story, because
Right.
the garden being a royal garden. And so even though we might not think of a serpent as a royal beast,
Right.
there's still some sort of uh, high level idea, especially with the idea of serpents and throne guardians.
Right.
So that's an interesting kind of wrench to throw into there as well.
Right.
Like
Well, I want to
just
clarify really
layers of
quickly.
meaning.
I want to clarify really quickly. Like, I'm saying that the dumb one in the story is not the donkey; it's Balaam.
Right.
So it's just like, because we would expect it to be the donkey, but no, it's not.
Mhm.
The donkey's the wise one. So I just want to make a
Right.
point of clarification there, because the dumb one is Balaam, not the donkey.
Right.
So,
Yeah, a source of wisdom. And
right.
that's fascinating
Yeah.
because, again, you're not expecting the animal, whatever its like particular metaphorical view of the ancient world, you would expect the one who is doing the oracle. Balaam was particularly sent for that purpose. That was
Mhm.
his job. He was the one who was supposed to be the conduit of the oracle. And instead, we have the donkey who is being that conduit to him, first of all. And that's fascinating just to have that.
Right.
Uh, this idea of like, how would a prophet even do what he was doing? And of course, there's different ideas for that. But here we have an actual story of this is how he's actually getting the wisdom from God. And I mean, of course, we're gonna we if we are have any familiarity with the ancient world, it's this. We know that they would use animal bones, they'd use entrails, they would use, um, if birds flew across the sky during the sunset in particular ways, that could be an oracle, right? So the idea of animals being part of the oracle is not that strange, but what we have is God giving the oracle through the animal to somebody who is only partially related to Israel. And yeah, I think the whole idea of the contrast between Israel, the nations, and then you have kind of a third category, because we tend to think of only the two categories,
Right.
Israel and the nations. We forget that there's kind of a third category there. There's the people of Moab and elsewhere who are related to Israel in ways that they are not the chosen, but they're also not the nations. And so that's, I don't know, that's a whole mess of things you could talk about from that.
Right. Which is why I wanted to throw that in there, because people
Mhm.
forget that the sons, not the chosen ones, but Ishmael, Esau, and the twins, Joseph's twins, Ephraim and Manasseh, the one who is not the chosen one still has some blessing. There's some curse mixed in there with it, depending on how they play out their life and the choices that they make, which is one of those other beautiful things that we don't have time to get into anyway either. This idea of choosing, and how you don't have to choose the curses. You can choose to do what God says and avoid the curses. But anyway, but there's this element that plays into all these stories, and this is one in Numbers 22 that really plays into that there are, you're right, like there's multiple groups, which is why I want to make sure to point those things out sometimes, because we don't think about always see a lot of people focus on the bad imagery of Moab, but you got to keep going back and back and back and back and further and follow that line all the way down to what did God actually say and what did Abraham actually say to Ishmael. And so there's a lot of complex interplay that's going on there that we again don't have time to get into, but
Right. Well, and just the fact that we have kind of a royal symbol that is associated here outside the nation of Israel, that's fascinating to me, because again, it's just not the simple black and white either, or there's more going on. And I think that there's this idea of how God can provide, and maybe this even plays into what we were saying earlier about God caring for animals and caring for creation in general. Like, we tend to again focus really narrowly on Israel, on the chosen, on the royal line, but there's threads that are all over the place that show that the picture is wider than that, and that God has a wider concern and a wider care, but there's a focus because of messianic concerns and because of things like this, right? And Israel was supposed to be something that would kind of unite people in a way, I think. And I think that's part of this story as well. Like, we're afraid of them. Balaam is being sent out because of fear, and God is it. I feel like this is kind of a story of patience by God, like literally patience, because there's a stubbornness not in the donkey, but in Balaam. And so the donkey, like, I think this is what you're saying, is Balaam and the donkey's roles are reversed. Yeah. And so when we have that stubbornness and God is being patient through the usual imagery of the stubborn one and saying, okay, I'm going to keep showing you something, but it's going to get serious. It's going to get more serious with each time I'm going to have to try and get through to you. And it's almost the case that Balaam was kind of forced to have his eyes opened. And that's interesting.
That's also the intertextuality and the biblical theology going on there with the echoing of what God's patience with Israel and God's patience with us. Like, if you're not going to get it all of this other ways, and it's echoing forward to what the prophets are going to be screaming about in all the major and minor prophet books. Like, I showed you this over and over and over again, even with a donkey, and y'all didn't get it. Like, it's just the thematic. So I want to jump into one of my favorite ones, and I get a question about this a lot because this is a very short story, but it confuses a lot of people. So we're going to jump into 2 Kings chapter 2 down there at the end, starting in 23, with those young men and Elisha and the bear. And I love this. I love this story. It's because there's actually a lot that's very similar that's going on there. That's what was going on with Balaam and the donkey. Like, so you've got, so if you don't, I'll just read it because it's only 3 verses long. So it says, now when they went up from there to Bethel, and he was going by the road, some young men came out from the city and ridiculed him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And when he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 of the boys. And he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. This is one of the things I love about Hebrew and the way they tell stories, because it's like the dude just sat there after being made fun of and watched an animal come out and kill a whole bunch of guys, and then he's just like, okay, and then he left. It's just like I love this.
I think I would need to take a moment there and wonder if I should move, wonder if I should climb a tree. I don't know.
I just love, there's so much that's in these 3 little, and Hebrew packs a lot into just a couple of verses when it does stuff. it can do it in a very short space. A lot of people, you get a lot of, at least I do, get a lot of questions about this section because people are like, what is up with God sicking bears on people?
Mhm.
And first of all, why are bears eating children? But there's a correction that needs to be made for them there. It's not small children. These are like, middle schoolers who everyone who's had a middle schooler has been tempted to
Sick a
call
bear on
down.
them.
That's right, exactly. Any of us who've survived middle schoolers have definitely been in this position with Elijah and would love to call down an animal to bring them under control because they can be mouthy and interesting little people. So these are not small children. These are more, middle school, young high school age kids who should know better. And I think that, well, okay, before I go into too much of what I think. So Carrie, what do we do with mocking teenagers and female bears eating a bunch of them? Like, what's going on
Well,
here?
I mean, I would say the same thing that I said with the story with Balaam. We get really stuck on this image, and rightly so. It's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to make us stop and think. Like, if we're reading like the Bible, if we're doing a reading plan of the Bible in a year and you're just kind of zooming through everything, it doesn't seem like this is something that is like, it's so short. It almost seems like to us who are trying to read a whole long text and not stop on each part, we're like, apparently this is okay with God, and somehow, like, we get this idea in our head that it's so short and that means that it's kind of like there's not a whole lot there to investigate and to think about, and that it's just this story of, well, look how cruel God is because this is the kind of thing he would do. But I would say that the shocking aspect of it is meant to pull you back, meant to make you meditate on it longer rather than a shorter period of time just zooming through the text. That's the first thing I would say. And then, every time an animal is introduced, I think that a big part of the thing we're supposed to do is to bring in all of the imagery and ideas that we have that they're going to be thinking about with that animal, because they didn't have teddy bears, so teddy bears aren't this image we should be thinking of how they're thinking about bears. Rather, a bear is going to be a picture of the wilderness and a picture of danger. And when we're thinking of the wilderness and danger, it's not just some neutral thing. Those are imagery of judgment, basically.
Mhm.
So this is a really, like you said, super condensed way of demonstrating that picture of exile, of judgment, of, if you're not going to listen to me and you're just going to go and do whatever you want, you're going to have consequences for that. And it's not God coming out from the cloud and throwing lightning bolts himself. This is judgment that is, I mean, I don't want to use the word natural because we tend to throw in words and ideas with the idea of natural versus, that doesn't mean supernatural.
Right.
For them, natural and supernatural were one thing.
Right.
It was entirely a package deal. So if a wild animal would do something, it was a reflection of the supernatural in some form. The question is, what did that mean and why? So I think
Right.
a lot of that is just packed in there.
Well, I think we're gonna dive into a little territory that might get us into a little bit of trouble, but neither one of us care about that. So this will be kind of fun. So one of the other things I think we have to think about and remember when we're looking at why all these stories are in here, because again, the Hebrew mind, while it's wonky and whimsical and thinks in imagery and pictures a lot of the time, is also extremely intentional in what they meditate on and what it means. And I think that there's this really interesting view that some people have of how the Bible came together, and have this very strange concept of everyone has a different definition of big words like inerrancy and of how the canon was created, and so. But I don't think that some of those more restricting views kind of take into account some of what's happening, because a lot of what we consider the Bible that most of us have in front of us, and it's going to, this is what very wildly by tradition. So we're just going to kind of stay as in the middle of the road path here as we can. But a lot of that, especially the Old Testament, is being collected partly in the exile itself, and partly in the return from exile, as they're recollecting together the scraps of all the dignity they can to figure out how did we get here. And they're pulling all of the stories and scraps of scrolls that they can find, and anyone who's alive that carried the oral traditions together, getting those all recorded and putting the what we consider now the Old Testament together. They are grieving this loss. They are trying to grapple with who are the people of God. And we see in Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, and then Haggai comes along, they get back to the promised land, and that's not what they're expecting. They're expecting to see what Joshua saw. They're expecting to see provision and bounty and a place that's already prepared and everything laid out that takes no work to walk into. And that's not what they're walking into. And they're like, what in the world is going on here? And so part of a big part of what's happening is they're putting together what we consider the Old Testament is how do we look at every story to help us grapple with that and to grapple with what's supposed to come next. And so like this story here is another little micro way of expressing the grief that you see in Ezekiel and that you see in most of the prophets, where they're sitting down like, how did we get here? Well, and God's like, okay, let me show you. Israel's just walking along, and Israel, you're not Elisha. You're those unwise, wise young men who come out mocking the prophet, and the judgment has to happen because there's no, you don't do that. God does not tolerate mockery. So part of why you're here, Elisha, and this story with the bears, that's kind of helping them process and understand why they ended up in the situation they ended up in. So we have to really step back and think about not just what granularly in its own little pocket does this story mean. In the bigger scope of a picture, they're replaying this whole grief thing.
Right. And that's really key, because when we come across these stories and we're shocked and we are appalled, we're supposed to be. There's a story here of importance. There's a story that you're not supposed to be in that situation where this is going to happen. I don't want that for you, God says.
Right.
That's why I'm sending you the prophets. That's why you went into exile, so that you could form the identity to understand this relationship I have with you. And you're so hard-headed and stubborn, like Balaam, that you're not going to get it unless I show you in these really vivid imagery. And it's hard and it's terrible. And they're not just here and then we just move on with the story like it's not a big deal. I mean, that's what we see. That's why we have the microcosmic ideas and pictures here, but then the meta-narrative pictures of the exile. And it's just what we see over and over. We are thinking in terms today, usually, of we have the incident in the garden, that's the origin of sin, and everything just happens after that, versus being able to see the cyclical patterns of time and the cyclical patterns that we live out ourselves. And we're supposed to see ourselves in this. Who are you? Are you the children? Are you the prophet? Are you, what is your relationship with what God is trying to do? So for the person who is reading this in its compiled form with everything else together, I mean, that's why I think canonical readings are absolutely essential. You cannot get the meaning without that, because it was compiled purposefully, intentionally. There is a reason this is here. What is that reason? What is the message we're supposed to take away? And it's not this happy-go-lucky, God's fine with people being torn apart by bears.
Right.
It's a different level than that. And if you're reading it from the context of people who basically their whole corporate society was torn apart by the bears, what do we do now? Like, there's absolutely a grief for what's gone before, and how do we step into something that is not that? And we can go in and be like all judgmental, be like us versus them.
Right.
In the context of the story of Israel and the Hebrew Bible, it's not an us versus them, it's an us. This is us. Yep. This is who we are. This is what we've experienced. We've been here. How do we not do that? And how do we have that better relationship with God to avoid it, and to lament the fact that we have been there, and to be really forthright with the fact that we have.
Right. And I think that's where one of my big pet peeves is, people who say dumb things like, we should just, unhitch from the Old Testament. We don't, it's been fulfilled. We don't need it anymore. It's not relevant. We don't know, because what really ultimately is happening for us right now, Carey, these are our stories. As Christians, these are our stories. These are our lessons. These are our mistakes. And we have that same bundle of wisdom, because it just keeps getting handed down generation to generation. We carry all of that with us, and not just, I'm sorry, but understanding life and the universe didn't start the day Jesus was born. Jesus is stepping in and continuing a tradition that he wrote and a history that he guided. So it's ours too. Sorry, this is one of my soapboxes that I get up on, because it really does kind of drive me nuts.
Right, because the way that we talk about it matters. It matters a big deal. Like, I'll even see people saying, "Oh, it's obsolete. These are just the trappings that Jesus has done away with." And even if they don't really mean it exactly like that sounds, and they're saying, well, okay, so yes, of course, there's this but there's still a dividing line that they're drawing in the sand, saying old versus new. And there is the old versus new, but the new is meant to be deeply connected, versus just, we're going to go and throw that out with the trash. And you don't have to worry about it anymore. And those are old things. They don't matter. Like, no, they do matter. Sacrifice matters. Priesthood matters. All of the imagery of judgment and exile and Exodus, all of that is part of our story. And I like how you put that. And I think that if we're not seeing that these are our stories, even if we're not ethnically whatever we want to say, it doesn't matter. This is the whole point of being God's people and living out God's purposes in life in all of this. And I mean, if we look at ourselves individually in our own communities, all of that, we'll do the same thing that the Israelites did. Who are we in these stories, and what does that mean for how we should be living out our Christian lives as disciples of Jesus?
Right. I just, it took me a lot of work to get there, to understand that, coming out of a tradition that was so wooden in the way that it looked at things, that, there's, it just, now I get So I love to talk about the bigger and how it all, comes together, because it does matter. And it should show us, like, this is a pattern of behavior that started from the beginning, that humans cannot master themselves. And it just plays out over and over and over again. And I think it was like Eleanor Roosevelt, maybe. Um, I don't remember. So it was a quote I saw from a woman. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was like, said something to the effect of, "Learn from the mistakes of others because you don't have time to make them all yourself." It's just like, and that's how we should look at the Old Testament, I think. So I'm going to jump to one more if you have time, for another one, because this is one of those that for me was really hard to sit through when we were going through the minor prophets. And we're going to jump to the book of Joel, and you've got the locusts. And this one, he started class that day with showing a video clip of locusts. And I was like, I'm not looking. I'm not going to watch. I can't look at that. Like, ew, no, ew. It just, because locusts, and anybody who lives in an area that has locusts kind of has a better grasp on what this imagery is doing here. But bugs are another underappreciated thing in the Bible, because there's a lot going on with bugs. But one of the really fascinating things when we were talking about this in prophets class, because in that class there was only 3 of us and everyone was at Hebrew. So we went straight into the Hebrew for stuff. And those are referred to as the army of God. Like, the bugs are considered one of God's armies. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. So, like, which goes back with our theme of, I think, what's going on with the bears and the donkeys, like the locusts, and what's happening with Carrie. What is happening with these locusts here? Because most of us naturally are going to recoil and go, ew, bug, yuck. And there's some of that's happening here, but we also have to remember, like with the Hebrew, that those are an army of God. So what in the world with bug armies? What's going on with bug armies?
Right? Yeah. Well, and again, I think we're supposed to be all creeped out by it. Why wouldn't we be? Like, these are imagery of, like I mean, they're not to get into clean and unclean, but there's some connection there to those things. And there's a connection, again, to wilderness, to judgment, to threat of flourishing for civilization and for provision. Like, so, we're supposed to plant fields, harvest grain, make bread, have liturgy with that, have relationship with God with that. That's part of the actual sacrificial system. So if God is sending something that is attacking those things, that's really serious. Like, that's something that is not just creepy, but it's threatening your ability to survive and have liturgy with God and relationship. Those two things are kind of hand in glove. Your provision and your relationship and sacrificial system, all of that, those two things they're not like separate, just like natural and supernatural aren't separate. So yeah, there's a whole lot of really strange stuff with that. But the fact that it's connected to God is like, okay, like this is
Mhm.
right. We're really getting into some deep water with the idea of what does God's judgment look like and how is it enacted in the world. He's not throwing the lightning bolts from the sky, but there's locusts, and that's a big deal. And that's even worse than just a single lightning strike from the sky. Right? Like, there's a whole lot of
Right.
layered meaning to that.
Right. And it just, oh, I can't get past. Well, first of all, I'm stuck, and so I want to go back, and because you use the L word, and several people have problems with that word. So I want to stop and go, hold on, let's context that for a second, because some people have an allergic reaction to that word. So we're talking about the word liturgy for those. So she was Carrie mentioned a couple times that this is threatening the things that come together in the Levitical system that helps define liturgy. And so if we're going to use liturgy, so here I'm in my channel on this little corner of the internet, I use the understanding of liturgy as a rhythm of participation. So liturgy is in this context the way Carrie's talking about it. Well, I'll let Carrie explain for herself, but I'm understanding you to say, Carrie, this is the pieces that come together that make up the parts of how we perform that liturgy of participating in those rhythms of relationship with God. So I just want to make sure people listening don't get freaked out
Sure.
because all of a sudden you're like,
Well, it's
like,
similar to the allergic reaction people will have to the term Eucharist. Even though the
yep,
term Eucharist is a biblical term, when people throw in the words Eucharist or liturgy, there is this, wait a second, you're only talking about a certain sector of Christianity, and that has nothing to do
right.
with me. But liturgy is just again, I like the word you used, rhythms of participation with God. So you might not have a very high liturgical church, but you do have practices that you do. Your Sunday services are set up in particular ways to have a particular flow so that everybody knows what's going on and everybody's on the same page. You know how approximately, well, at least usually, you know how long the service is going to be, you know what's going to happen first and second and third. All of that is part of liturgy. It's just your communal practice together, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
But most Christians will have some form of communion or Lord's table, and that is associated one way or another with bread and with the juice of the vine, we'll say. And those are imagery of agriculture and provision and life. So whatever you're using for that, however you're seeing it, however often you do it, it's something that is going to bring us together as participants and in our relationship and worship of God. So that's kind of how I frame all of that, even though I use scary words sometimes that I forget sometimes that, because I
Right.
come from, I come from even beyond the evangelical world, but I'm not in a particularly high liturgical practice. At least I don't come from that. But I still see that it's something that should join us together in understanding that we all have practices of worship of God that binds us together in community. And I think that those are life-giving, and that even if you don't have a high liturgical practice, you're understanding that these matter in some form, right? Whether you just have a memorial view of communion, well, you're still understanding what God is doing, remembering what God is doing, and kind of connecting with the people of God in the past and today. So it's kind of a comprehensive thing that is meant to bring us together, even though it sadly often separates us. That's a pet peeve of mine as well.
Well, and I think too that to even more unscary that word liturgy, that all of us have a daily our lives have a rhythm of liturgy. When your kids are in school, you're anchored to the school calendar, and that creates a rhythm. Like, people who go to work, or the things that we do that define the thing, the our schedules, and the things that we all have certain things that we always do. That is another form of liturgy. So we don't need to be scared of that word.
Mhm.
And we say the word liturgy, we're not saying you need all the smells and bells
Right.
and you have to do all the stuff that, okay.
Mhm. Right.
It,
Well, and
I,
another really good example would be like praying for thanks over a meal. That
right,
is, that's basically the idea that I'm
right.
attaching to this.
Right.
If you give thanks to God for what he's giving you, then you're acknowledging that provision from God. And so when the locusts come and attack your crops, that's putting that in danger, because if you don't have bread to put on the table, you can't give thanks to God for that bread, and it's interrupting that process. But the reason God's sending the locusts is probably
Right.
because you're not giving him thanks anyway.
Right.
You have already disrupted that.
Right. I think
So
that's
it's not
important.
God who's like,
Right.
I'm just randomly going to do this to you. It's you've already left the idea of giving God thanks to his provision. And so I think that a lot of this is pulling in the I will give you what you are already living into kind of a feel to it. If you don't want to be participants with me in relationship, this is the outcome that happens when that happens. And this is not like this tit for tat. If you don't pray over your food, God isn't going to send an army of locusts by necessity. It's a
Right.
whole pattern of behavior that this is a picture of what's going on a very deeper, wider, systemic level. And again, it doesn't mean that every time we have problems with our crops, this is a judgment from God. But we have to keep in mind that canonical story. That's why these are here.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that every time something happens in history ever that we need to map these stories on. But these stories are illustrative of the Israelites' understanding of God and what God is doing and their relationship to him. So they know they've abandoned him at times, and this is a description of the outcome of how serious that is.
Right. So this is going to be a little bit of a not serious thought on on this, but I'm like, so are you saying, Carrie, that just because I didn't pray 3 times a day this week, that God's not going to come eat all the bananas in Peru, so I can't have my bananas for breakfast next week?
I mean, I was raised with those kinds of thoughts, though. The idea that if you miss out on church one week, you won't receive the blessings. And I mean, to a certain degree, I get it, because if you're not there, you weren't able to say hi to your friends. You weren't able to participate in the communal prayers and the sermon or whatever, whatever's going on. You're not being blessed and upheld by those things because you weren't there to experience them. So there is that. But attaching that to this wider idea of God blessing you or not is problematic. That's going in the realm of kind of pagan notions of the reciprocal, transactional. The gods have to be bribed in order to provide a good harvest for the people, versus the biblical understanding of a true relationship where God is loving and wants to give you things because he loves you, and it's based on love, it's based on trust, versus I'm just a capricious God who needs to be appeased. And I feel like if we're treating blessings and cursings as this capricious tit for tat kind of a situation, that's not what we have in the Bible and its presentation. Even
Which
though
I
it
would
is so easy to go down those and see that.
It is. Which I think I would nuance something that you just said, because going back to where we started, that it's not utilitarian, it's reciprocal. Because, at least how I understand the reciprocal nature is that God created out of an overflow of abundance of love and blessing. So in wanting to share that, he created. And then we, in an overflow of that love and abundance that we are given, give back. And so, and that's the pattern we see between us and God, but that's also the pattern that we see between us and the people that we share this planet with, and us and the animals that we were created with. Like it's very much a giving back and forth of an overflow of love and blessing. Whereas utilitarian is going to turn it into a legalistic system. And, it takes us to, or at least in my mind, intertextuality. We jump to where Jesus and his dealing with the Pharisees. And a lot of people, I think, get this nuanced improperly as well, where he's not attacking the system itself per se, but their hypocrisy in not living up to their own system. He's like, you say this, but you don't even do what you say. It's your heart, your hypocrisy. So I think it's a lot more that these animal stories and how they're used and the imagery that comes with them is more about stepping us back into the participatory reciprocal and getting us out of the utilitarian legalistic functionality of the imagery of the thing, of the practice, of, so that we're more intentional with that piece. So where is my heart instead of what is your function is the most important thing here, I think.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought out all of that nuance, because it's so, I said before something about how it's hard to communicate these things without getting the wrong idea across. Like it's really hard. But a good human relationship is the same way.
Mm-hmm.
It should not be boiled down to transactional, I do this, you do that, and these are the reasons that attach those two things, versus a underlying reciprocal relationship where those things are still happening, but the reason is not to get something out of the other person, but the reason is because I love you, and that is the reason. And yes, hopefully the intent and purpose should be a reciprocal response. If you're not doing it, there's no reciprocal response, the relationship is broken.
Yep.
So there is that reciprocation and the back and forth nature of both of parties. And that's not the same as a transactional thing, because there's an underlying motivation and focus and purpose there. And the same kind of action, same kind of behavior sometimes. Mm-hmm. Entirely different meaning and entirely different intent. And that's really very important to see, but it's hard to communicate because you're going to use the same words sometimes to say those two things. That's hard.
Yeah, which is why I try to be intentional to separate my vocabulary and the words that I use, and I'm getting better at it, but I always have to stop and be like, okay, hang on, because I heard you use the word reciprocal in a way that I would use the word utilitarian. So I was like, wait, okay, hang on, I want to back that up and just clarify. That was what I think what was going on. I just am going to say that's not the way I use that vocabulary, so I want to clarify. So just a point of order there. But yeah, I think you expressed it beautifully. So is there an animal image or story or picture, Carey, that you want to throw out? Because I've thrown all of them out so far. And somebody earlier asked about our favorite Bible birds. So maybe if there's like a bird thing that kind of strikes you, or a good animal that we haven't gotten to that you would like to cover, I think that would be kind of fun too.
Birds are strange, both in the Bible and in real life. They're just bizarre. Actually, this last week, I know that I've always had like bird nests in my trees outside my house. This year is the first time I actually noticed where one was. So I had this nest of baby robins, and I noticed them fairly early on because I just saw them popping up their little heads, and they were still clearly a few days old, but pretty young. So I got to kind of watch them, and they just barely flew off the other day. And that's fascinating to see that care and provision in the animal world, just in the wild. Like that's... Mm-hmm. It mystifies me every time I see something like that. How does the animal world be this organized? How do they find each other? How do they know what to do? Like, what does the mama bird think when she comes back to the nest and her babies are gone? You know, I just think about all those things. And so birds are weird, and just watching them it's so strange. They're so different from other types of animals. And I think that the Bible also kind of sees that difference for birds as well. I kind of like I don't know if I want to say like, but I'm intrigued by the more negative connotations of birds in the Bible as being like night birds and things like that, vultures and owls and things like that, because they have some really strange imagery associated with them.
Yes, they do.
You know, and birds are also kind of this similar thing. Like, most people will see a vulture and they'll be a little bit creeped out by them. They're kind of weird looking and they feed on wild animals. But I don't know. I think the differences in that make me more interested in them because, you know, we have a couple of vultures in my zoo. I love to watch them because of their mannerisms. They look strange, but if you kind of see past that and see their uniqueness, I don't know.
Well, it's really interesting that you land on owl because this is one of those things where there's some dispute about the owl imagery in the Old Testament, and especially if you look at Isaiah 34:15, which is it says in what translation am I looking at? I don't even know. I'd have to look. I'm in the NASB right now because that's what popped up. I change the settings all the time. My Logos hates me because I'm constantly changing which my top Bible is, so it pop up. I never know. It's a surprise what version I'm going to get. But so Isaiah 34:15 in the NASB says, "The tree snake will make its nest and lay eggs there, and it will hatch and gather them under its protection. Yes, the hawks will be gathered there, every one of its kind," which that word there, tree snake, is also translated owl, because we're not completely sure which one of that is because of a textual variant, because it's such a rare word in Hebrew that but you know, the last thing you're going to think when you're like owl imagery, tree snake. Okay. That's weird. And what is going on there? Because it's just, you know, Isaiah again, this back to the prophets and all that stuff is weird in the prophets. It's meant to be.
Right. Well, and animals, in just studying animals, especially all of the different types of animals, is hard because it goes back to differences in linguistic differences, especially when you'll have different animals in different zones, right? Like in Israel, they're going to have different animals than in Egypt and things like that. And so they'll use similar words, even though they don't. What do I want to say? Like, one people will use a word and then it will be kind of widespread in linguistic ways, like roots and etymology and things like that. But then it can change according to what your location is, because not everyone has the same animals, but you're going to use related words anyway. So it's very complicated.
Right, because, you know, like what's an owl to us in North America is not necessarily going to be the same
Right.
picture as someone who's writing, you know, when Baruch is writing this down, it's not, even if it's the same word, it's not the same. We're not looking at the same bird, or even if it's a bird at all. Like there's
That's
so we have to kind
fascinating.
of
Yeah.
yeah, it gets
Mhm.
really complicated there with all of these animals. I mean, there's some that we're fairly certain, but you get into some of these weirder references, which is why before
Mhm.
we started, I was telling you about that person who contacted me about, is this word, this creature, is this a dinosaur? And I was like, I don't know, but we don't know. I mean, we don't know, and we don't have, I don't think, an
Mhm.
equivalent of one-to-one equivalent to point to say yes, it is.
Right. And
Not
we
all of
might not even have those animals anymore. So
right.
there's also that. Mhm.
Right. It gets really, yeah, it does. It with the birds too. I want to land for just a second. If you have, I forgot to ask you how long you have, so I'm just going to keep talking until you tell me I can't talk anymore. But I want to talk about quail because that's another one of those really interesting things. And you get into most people are familiar with quail in the Exodus story, where it's very interesting that they start with the manna, and after a while, that's not enough, and so God comes in and provides them with quail. And any of us who've been hunting more than once, like you don't go to sleep at night before on your hunting trip and wake up, and then there's already broken down carcasses of that animal laying all around you to just go pick it up, right? But this is what's happening here. Like it's not, it's not like God brings a cute little family of quail birds to the door of your
Oh,
tent
I've
and then
never thought about that. Were the
right,
quail alive or not?
right. That's
That's
not
not
like,
something I never pictured,
but
because
this is
I
not the
pictured them
imagery that
being
we have,
alive,
right?
especially because
Mhm.
of the imagery of um, like scavengers.
Mhm.
Like, are the Israelites now acting as scavengers? That's
Right.
interesting.
But
That's not something I've ever
it's
thought about.
well, I think I'd have to go back and look again, but I think when I looked into this before, there's some of the same wording that's going on within Leviticus when it turns from being an animal to a carcass that's no longer the animal that is offerable for sacrifice, that makes it so it's not you're not dealing with the dead corpse, you're dealing with the meat of an animal.
Right,
So I think there's a
right.
switch of language that's going on there,
Ooh,
but it's just translated quail, so we miss it. But it's just like
that's an interesting thing. Oh, it's a
I know
rabbit
I said
trail. Okay, thanks.
yeah,
Thanks for the other
well,
rabbit trail.
the first time I said that to somebody, it completely you could tell it just shut down their whole entire brain processing because they were like, "Wait, what?" Because a lot of us just think that here's these cute little quail birds just sitting there, and you pick them up and there's dinner, and I'm like, "But that's not exactly what's going on there. That it turns it into more sacrificially type language that is provision, that is sharing a meal with God, which is what's happening there, which, that, but I don't know. That was one that really sidetracked and got me off on a on a track for a while. That whole idea of, what is actually going on there? Because is it doesn't actually say they were alive. It actually does.
Yeah, that's okay. That is like I said,
Another thing for
you're
your
gonna
list
put me
there.
into a whole rabbit trail here because that's fascinating. Well, and
Yeah.
the all of that is wrapped up in this idea of that I find absolutely fascinating between what's going on with a live animal and what's going on with meat, and how ritual, or we might say God's participation in what's happening there, is a
Mhm.
key factor. So the God providing the quail, if they're just out there dead outside your tent, versus finding a dead animal in the wild. Those can't be the same thing,
Right.
because you wouldn't be able to eat that kind of an animal because it would still have its meat. Now, of course, or blood. But yeah, birds are harder because they have little blood, and so that's harder
Right.
for that, the sacrificial system to deal with those in a different way compared to other animals. But there's something that's going on there that is a very big
Mhm.
difference. That's
Yeah.
cool.
It's yeah, it's one of those that I was like, "Wait a second." A couple people have brought up ravens too. And
Mm.
raven that's one I'm not as familiar with because I haven't dug into ravens in the Bible. I mean, I don't even know. I'm assuming that there are since people are bringing it up, but it's not what
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
familiar with.
you have it's really interesting with the Noah putting out the birds.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
why do we have a difference between the raven and the dove? And how does that relate to ancient Near Eastern parallels with the flood story that also have birds? Lots of interesting rabbit trails there as well, for sure.
Actually, yeah. Now that you say that, now I have questions. Talk on it. I guess turnaround is fair play here. Now I have questions because I never really thought too deeply about that, because you see the doves coming and going, but the raven, it's just kind of like
Right.
it's a scavenger,
Mhm.
and it's an unclean animal. It attacks defenseless young animals. And Tiffany's talks about crows pecking out the eyes of their prey, and like it ravens are very interesting dark imagery in the ancient Near East, apparently, as I'm looking at this.
Yeah, that's generally the thing, which is then really interesting that they're on their symbol associated with the ark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a whole thing I'm collecting notes on currently. So
Right. That's really interesting. Sorry, I'm also getting sidetracked with this whole looking at like what's going on with ravens? Like, oh, I haven't looked into that. That's really fascinating. Oh my goodness. That's gonna give me something to do this afternoon. That's that's for sure. So, Carrie, I think kind of summing all of the wanderings through some of our favorite animal imagery and animal stories. There's a lot that people would be like, well, what about this and what about that? And
I know there's so much.
there's so
The whole
many
thing on it.
there. But I think that where I kind of want to spend the last of our time here is kind of where we've been a little bit, but rolling it all back together. That animal imagery is got a lot of things, and animals have a lot of things going on there. But I think it's uh, it involves that this is something that God cares about, so that we should care about it as well. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if these animals and their utility function is maybe something that we would consider something like dark, like ravens who are scavengers and will attack defenseless, and some of the well, if they're supposed to be part of creation, part of the thing that we use to participate with understanding God and creation around us, what is that telling us from here's their utility, but what is that telling us about the reciprocal relational piece? Like, balancing those two things together, that all of it ultimately stepping back into the bigger biblical theology, all of it should point us to how we interact with God and with each other, because that's the whole, I don't want to say this, but function of creation is participatory all the way around, all the way up and all the way down, all the way side to side. It's the vertical and the horizontal, all does the same thing. So how should we get to help us get to the practicals of how do we start thinking that way when we encounter animal imagery in the Old Testament?
Okay, that's a really deep question, actually. It is, because
Sorry,
you
yeah.
tend to think of the really core center of things as being vertical, horizontal, right? That's a really good image of what we have in the church and what we have in the Old Testament. God and people together, and all of that is connected, and it images itself, right? When we interact with other people, we are to image God, we are to be his representative, and that means caring for people, that means providing for them, that means restitution and justice and all of those pictures. But then we loop in the animal world and creation as a whole. And I mean, if you look at the Hebrew Bible and the amount of words, it associates with land. And land isn't
Right.
alive. Why is it so deeply embedded in that? So it's not, so, I tend to think of the horizontal and vertical as God and people, God and the people of God, whether that's the Old Testament or today with the church. But there's also all of that. So when we think about being the image of God, it's not just interacting with each other, it's also interacting with the wider creation. How do you do that? Not just with relating properly with people, but relating properly with the creation in our care of the land and our association and experience with animals. And if you look at animals in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, there's categories. We have domestic animals, we have wild animals, we have, and they have different images. But even with with that, I think Genesis 1 gives us a picture of provision for all. So it's not just the domestic animals that God is concerned about. It is the wild, because he is providing the nourishment for them, just as he's providing the nourishment for humans, and humans are to care for their animals and provide the nourishment for them and manage all of that properly. So that's an interesting angle to consider, to loop into our, again, I'll use the scary word liturgical idea of our, just thinking in terms of worship is not just what you do on a Sunday morning, but what you do with our relationship to God and the world and each other. When we are sent out into the world after our church service, perhaps, some church services have kind of a formal way of doing that, of we're doing something here and it's not meant to stay just in this time and in this place,
Right.
but it's meant to seed out into the world and to affect that. That's people, but it's also our relationship with creation as a whole. That's a really interesting angle to kind of loop into what we're thinking about. I like that.
Right. Well, and I have come to think of it in that way because I started with getting shifted to the horizontal vertical, and I'm still trying to figure out how to morph that to even bigger. Because I think if you do it correctly, it is you step back and you end up with something that looks like the interaction of the Trinity. Like I think you really do when it's fully lived out the way that it's supposed to be done. The horizontal and the vertical ends up turning into and that kind of Trinitarian interaction on all of these levels, which is a really, I'm still pondering how to do that in a way that makes sense to other people instead of the imagery in my head that doesn't always translate well until I figure out how to do that. But yeah, I think too, we also, going back to like Balaam's donkey and Elisha's bears, not getting stuck on, you know, what is going on with this donkey or why are the bears doing this thing? Like stepping back to be okay in the bigger story of what's happening here. How is this being used? Because like ravens are known for scavengers, usually don't have a great positive association with them. Yet that's how God fed Elisha in the desert. So there's a lot of God flipping things off of its normal use to set you off guard as to what is happening here. So stepping back, Carey, how do we step back and context those things and dealing with when it's unexpected? And what does it tell us when it's unexpected and out of its normal pattern?
Well, this is why I like talking a lot about metaphor and figurative imagery and trying to get across the point that those don't mean fake. They're not disconnected from reality. But when an image is being pulled up, then it's communicating something far broader and in an easier way to communicate than it would if it was laying it all out in, let me just explain it all to you here without any interesting images to think about. I think one of the reasons why I think you probably want to go into this exploration of the horizontal and vertical with the Trinitarian patterns and all of that is because it has that further and higher explanatory way, right? Because we don't just use words and explanations and mathematical formulas in our brains. That's not actually how we think. We think in conceptual realities and picture images far more than we do just single words and definitions, because you kind of had to learn those things as you grew up. You're not born with having a full vocabulary.
Right.
You learn those patterns and you learn them in the context of the wider world. But then we tend to grow up and be like, okay, here's our definition. It only means this one single thing. And it's like, no, your word is pulling up a whole entire world. And you do that automatically. So, I think in particular, something like animal imagery is something that should make us stop and picture. It's not just, this is the documentary picture of what Elijah ate, but rather here's something that it means beyond just the description of the acts that we have written down.
Right. And I think it's that pattern of the unexpected that we have to not get caught up on the fact that the waiters were a bunch of ravens. It's the fact that this is not what you would expect to be the agent of provision. A bird that's known for scavenging and stealing and hoarding is not usually the image that you're going to expect to give you food to a
Right.
starving man.
Right. And you have the first instance of, well, that's weird. Why is he being fed by birds? That first makes us stop. That's the first thing.
Yep.
Then you step into it with curiosity and say, well, what is the additional meaning here? And I think that's where you really get into the meat of deep Bible study. Curiosity. It's a quality. It's a quality we should be developing in ourselves, in my opinion, because it's that curiosity that drives our learning forward and really intersects with our devotional and our discipleship life to provide a way through with learning and with each other where we're curious about the text, we're curious about each other, we're curious about the world. All of those things should be combining to provide that big picture of why this ancient biblical text matters to us today.
Right. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was just about to go there and you said that, because curiosity is really, I think, the key to digging into things and not getting bogged down in the technicalities, which is one of the things I love so much about the narrative methodology. That's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day, but, not getting stuck on just one. But one of the things I love about the power of the narrative is it pulls you out and it really kind of brings you into this story. And that's what sparks our curiosity, because we are storytellers. We think in narrative, unless we're doing technical tasks, but we think in narrative. Our memories are stored as stories. We are story creatures. And I'm going to do an episode here coming up soon with Joshua Davidson and Garrett Skidema and Joshua Sherman, talking about the first 2 words of Genesis and nuancing that to being out of the imagination of God, adding that on top of the meaning of in the beginning. But that, we are born of a storyteller. So we are, as part of our image of God, participants in a story. And that's for me, like, always going back to the narrative. Like, hang on, if I'm stuck or I'm not understanding something or it doesn't make sense, I'm going to step back to the story. Where am I in the story? What's happening in the story? What's the bigger picture that's going on here? And curiosity is so, and I remember how before I made some changes in life that I remember going back and repeatedly to the leadership at the church I was attending, and just begging them for help because I felt like I was just spiritually starving to death. But it was a church that didn't feel as honest about curiosity. I think is a problem in a lot of, because we're not trained in school and we're not trained in the things that are used as metrics in our culture does not promote or encourage curiosity at all. In fact, it squashes it in most of it. And so now being in a space that feels much more embracing and encouraging of curiosity has just been, I'm like, I am so overflowing. I don't even know what to do with myself. It's like, I just like, but that space and how that we have to figure out how to, you know, encourage and spark that in people to, I think, push them through the dry dullness of, oh, I have to go do my Bible study now. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm carving out extra time because this is awesome, because I'm so curious about so many things. And I really want to jump and dig in, and that's where
Right.
the life is.
Yes. Yes. Uh, it's frustrating to me that we so often focus on differences and divisions because that creates this atmosphere that anything you're doing that is curious is somehow argumentative.
Right.
Like, I, how do you fix that? That's my question. How do we go from
Right.
making it this, you see something that's different, you see something that you disagree with, we automatically flip over to our, oh, we're arguing about it. We're trying to find out who's right versus, I'm really curious. I want to know more.
Mm-hmm.
The things you do to approach that might sometimes look the same, actually, but it's very different motivation, very different approach, and it's one of, where do we find the things that we agree with versus where we find things that disagree. And if we find things that we are divided in or that we disagree in, let's step into that in curiosity
Right.
versus an atmosphere of, I'm going to find out who's right, and that's going to be me. Like,
Right.
this is different things, two different things. You can still explore the space. You don't have to do it in the one way. There's another way to do it, but we're just not taught or encouraged to do it. And it's
Right.
something that I
Because you
think
and
a
I have,
lot of
yeah.
things that are now trying to help with that, but it's hard because it's
Mhm.
deep.
It is. And you and I have both throughout, in our lives gone through different spiritual journey and ended up in very different places. And even though there's a lot we agree on, there's sticking points in our different places and traditions where we ended up, where we could definitely separate and disagree, and that could really go badly. But I think the learning to approach that, okay, so you ended up there, like, tell me about that. Why is that meaningful and why is that significant to you? Instead of getting stuck up in my, well, I came out of that, so that's horrible, kind of thing, like, why is that meaningful and significant to you? We don't have to agree on it. And there's definitely things that you and I are not going to agree on. And that's okay, because that, I think, in pushing and curiosity to understanding the why is that significant to you, and not getting so hung up on why I think what you believe is not meeting the same level of significance to me as mine tradition does, is really important. So, I really think, and we should do the same thing, I think, at animal imagery. You bring in that curiosity as to, like, huh? Like, what? What in the world is going on here? Stepping outside of what I expect from that is really important. And Phil is stopping by to say hi. Hey, Phil. So I have a meme coming that I owe Phil from before. And Carrie's laughing because she knows it's her idea, but actually, but that's funny. Anyway, sorry, I got a sidetrack there. So to really wrap this up, I want to first of all say thank you, Carrie, and for the last point on curiosity being a good spot for dialogue, I want to give you a couple minutes to really talk about and launch your launch of your new platform and On the Rock. And I want you to talk about that because I think that that's a really cool thing, and not just because I'm doing a piece of it, but because I think it's a great spot and a great space for that. So I want to give you a couple minutes to really talk about that, and I'll have the links below underneath, because when I created this like forever ago, when we scheduled it, wasn't ready to launch yet, so I didn't put the information in because I didn't have it. So I'll make sure and add it below. But tell us about this, because that, I think, is exactly what your premise is, that I got really excited about. Like, hey, I'll come do something for you for that, because I love that idea. So go ahead, like, get into that, because that's cool.
Yeah, so I have my podcast, Genesis Marks the Spot, and I've been doing that for a couple of years. And I've noticed that there's so many people in the space of getting into the text, getting into serious study of the Bible, and trying to approach it in a way that is really, really helpful to people. That's the goal for a lot of people today, and it's growing so widely. But there's a problem sometimes where it's a little bit fragmented, or it can be. Now, thankfully, with things like your channel and networking people and talking online with other people, that's kind of bringing it all together. But at the same time, it feels like, so one thing that people do when they have a podcast or something, they will create a community for that podcast, which is great. That's awesome. But when I was thinking of doing that, I was like, it's not really my goal. I don't want to create a Genesis Marks the Spot community. I kind of already have that. I've got a Facebook group and I've got people and all of this. So I wanted to create a space that was a little broader than that, that was intentionally getting into contextual Bible study, or people who are approaching Scripture in a way that is honoring the context of Scripture, but also trying to make that intelligible to people and to bring that into real practice for the church as well. There's a lot of people doing that. So anyway, I created this, what I call a biblical theology community platform. It's called On This Rock, which is a bit, I think one of the reasons we chose that was because there's so much disagreement on this passage, where on this rock, what does that mean? And so I'm kind of highlighting a little bit of that to point out that even in our disagreements, if you're a Christian believer, your rock is truly Christ. He is the cornerstone. How do we build upon that, even with our distinctive differences, come together in unique Bible study and understanding the text and deeper exploration of that and moving that ahead? Like, I'm not trying to create some amazing answer to the divisions in the church or the distinctive things. I think that the answer to that is the church, and whatever that means. I don't know what that's going to look like, but we're all in this place of discipleship and learning about Scripture and trying to come together. So that's kind of my visionary idea of what it is and what it's about. You can just join for free. There's like ways you can support me in that, because it does cost me money and I'm going to be producing content for it. But at its heart, I want to just bring people together, and I want to bring them together in a focused way of discipleship that's rooted in the text, but that can also speak into your individual context and what you're trying to do. I can't force that. I can't force that to happen, but it's there for you to be a way that you can come and trying to gain perspective and curiosity with other people. If you have individual things that you are working on, come and bring them for a wider conversation about, how do I look at this? How do you look at it? Not in the sense of one of us has to be right, but let's get deeper into it, because we're all going to be a little bit off, and we can all kind of align and recorrect together, because we do have that focus of Jesus as the cornerstone. So that's kind of what it all is about. And it's fairly new. It's still very, very new, but I am really excited about it because I think that it has a lot of potential. I'm so excited about your space, Amber, about canonical narrative, because that's a deep, deep need for understanding how we can get exegetical work into the broader narrative and understand all of it together. And yeah, Phil also has a space there. We're doing projects there. So if you have a particular project that you'd like to have help with people, let's see if we can find people to help to bring that together into cohesion as well. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I have no idea what it will turn out to be, but it's fun.
There we go again. My tired brain running out of gas. One of the other things that really impressed me too, like you mentioned, like Phil has got a space there, and people that names here are going to be familiar with. Like Joshua Sherman's got got a space that he's going to be doing. I think Sean Schulte has a space that he's going to be doing some stuff. I thought I saw, or heavily involved in one that was getting into some of the weird things, because that's kind of his space there too. But the collection of people that you have coming in to kind of create things and content and offer like courses and different things like that is just a great bunch of people who care about like good conversations and getting to the truth and being able to agree amicably, disagree amicably. I can't speak anymore. I just give up. So, go into so links will be down below. There'll be some really good stuff once things get up and rolling, as many of us are still setting up and getting things figured out. So it will be fuller in a little while, but now is a good time to jump in and start looking at things. And I'm still collecting suggestions and things for people, and I'm got 2 tracks. I'm doing canonical narrative, the narrative, and I'm also going to look at canon and inerrancy and how that stuff all came together. And I know like that's going to get me in a lot of trouble, but that's okay because sometimes trouble has to be had, and that's why people like us
and
are around.
It's all about exploration and inviting people into the conversation. That's what it's all about. And when you get different people from different perspectives, that's when you get the best growth and the best learning. It just is. Right. And if you can't crowdsource learning, then you're going to be hampered. If all you have to do is your thoughts and your things that you're thinking about, you got to have other people inputting and challenging you. And it's fun. It's good. And you doing it in a safe atmosphere where we understand we all have a center and we all have a particular goal.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. So I'm not going to keep you any longer because I know you have all kinds of things to do, and I need a nap because I'm just tired and I'm still recovering from vacation. So thank you so much, Carey. I'll make sure and probably tomorrow, make sure all the links underneath to make where people can find all of your stuff are located down there. Go check out not only Carey's channel and Genesis Marks the Spot. It's got great stuff. Also go check out On This Rock, because I think there's some really good things that are going to be happening there once it's up and going. Some of it's free, some of it's behind a paywall, but I think it was like $5 a month, which was pretty cheap. So and you can come learn from not only just Carey, but myself and Phil and some really great people that don't get enough attention. Well, I get more than enough attention as it is, but some of those other people don't get enough attention. It's amazing. Anyway, sorry. Like I said, my brain is tired, so I'm just rambling at this point. So it's time to be done. Thank you, Carey. This was really a lot of fun. We didn't get quite as into the animals, but I don't think that was kind of the intention anyway. I think I really wanted to dig more into what do we do with them and how do those interact in the story and how do we look at stuff. And here's another really good one that just Linguist Amo, Adam. Gosh, I am tired. Another great content creator. He focuses on a lot of ancient Near East stuff. He's studying several of the ancient Near East languages and stuff like that. We're just wrapping up talking about how animal imagery is used in the Old Testament and the unexpected, and stepping back into the story to understand what's going on and not getting hung up on the mechanics of the story itself and what it means behind that, and the beauty of the unexpected and how curiosity leads us to be open to the unexpected. So it was a great conversation. Carey, I look forward to having you back again at some point, because you and I always just have a great time talking about things. And we just have so many fun things to talk about. And so I hope you all learned some great stuff and sparked some curiosity. And now I'm going to go track down some things about ravens, and Carey's going to go explore quail and what is happening in Exodus. You're welcome. And so I hope that you all have a really great rest of your week, and that your weekend is fantastic, and be blessed. Go check out Carey's content, sign up on her platform, and be well, be blessed. And around here, we always talk about journeying to dwell more closely with God every single day. God bless.